Okay, so a couple of days ago I just finished the technology unlocking system, which is a big deal. But I wasn't especially burnt out. It had gone rather well. And so I didn't need a day off, but also it felt weird to just start this huge other chunk of stuff, which is importing all of the art for the other styles of ships and making them work, like making the game load them and use them in the right circumstances. But I just decided to have a go at it anyway. And it was really nice because I had not set any expectations for myself or any obligations. It wasn't like I had to get feature X and feature Y done. I was just kind of exploring it, just like looking at, okay, what is the problem? What's my first action going to be? And what problems am I going to hit? I did immediately hit a bunch of problems that required John's attention, so it's good that that wasn't the day that I'd, was trying to actually get a concrete amount of stuff done, because I would need him to go off and do some stuff and come back to me. So I also turned it from a really boring legwork problem into a much more interesting code problem. And so it's about importing assets, and each one of them takes a certain amount of time to import, and there are about 40 of them per faction, and there are 3 factions I've got to import, and so it's a decent chunk of like manual labour, and I will do anything to avoid manual labour. I'll do it if there's absolutely no way I can automate it, and because any work you do you might have to redo, like it might be the wrong thing to do, including this, and if I spent like an hour importing assets doing this tedious repetitive work and then I found out it was the wrong thing to do, I'd just be fucking heartbroken. So instead I wrote a system. Instead of spending 1 hour importing assets, I spent 2 hours designing a system that I wouldn't have to import assets, and it reads them in from disk, and it assumes a certain file name, and it looks in a folder that depends on the faction, and all of that means that the code for one faction reading in its assets is exactly the same as another faction reading in its assets. And all I have to do is put all the files in the right folder, name them the right things, and the game will read them in. And this is good because A, it saves me that tedious work, and it's possibly even worth the 2 hours over the 1 hour because, well, A, if I need to change it at all, I can change it very easily, and B, I think I will need it later because I'm anticipating I'll hit memory problems where we have too much art loaded at once. And we don't need all the factions loaded at once. You're not going to be like getting into fights with 4 different factions all fighting each other. That sounds kind of cool, but it's not the game I'm making. And so I would like to be able to load one faction's art in during the game and unload the others. And I don't know how I'll do that. That's going to be difficult, and I'm not going to do it yet because I haven't hit those memory problems. But when I do, I'll need a system of reading them in from disk anyway. And if I had manually imported them all into the game the way I was planning to do it originally, I actually wouldn't have that choice. I'd have to remove them from the game, because anything you import into the GameMaker project is always loaded when it starts up. So if that's too much, I would have just broken the game. So yeah, I'm going to need a system like this anyway, and now it's in there and it works. It was a bit of work to get the first basic version of it working, but now it does, and the faction can load in all of its roof tiles. So today I'm going to extend that to work with, I think, probably the interior rooms. There are kind of 4 different categories of things that a faction needs to style a ship in its own way, like 4 different categories of art assets. One is the roofs of the modules, the thing that you see when you're from the outside. One is the rooms inside those modules, and there's about, I think, 12 different basic types of like actual shape of room. And then there's what we call the deco sprites, which are the actual features of the room. So if it's like a bathroom, then the toilets, and if it's a mess hall, then the tables and the things. That's for each room. That's all one sprite, and that gets layered on top of what shape the room is. And then, so that's 3 categories. The last thing, I'll leave it till last. Oh god, this is actually 2 categories. Oh god, it's going to be hell. The fringes, which is, if you piece something together out of blocks, either the edges of the actual shape of the ship that module is on the left-hand edge has to have a different edge to it than if it's flush against another module, because the outside of the ship will have like a bevel to it, or the corner of a ship shouldn't be exactly 90 degrees perfectly sharp. It might need some kind of smoothing, and we have those in there, but they will also have to be unique to factions. And what I just realised as I was saying it is that there's two sets of them. There's interior fringes and exterior fringes, and there's a lot of them, and loading them in is going to be harder than anything else, because they the origins are going to have to be in a different position. Like, they're a small amount of actual opaque sprites, pixels, and right now we're using them in a big transparent square so that I can place them just exactly onto where the module is, and it will just be flush with it. I don't have to calculate how far out should we display the sprite. I would just display it on the centre of the sprite, and then the sprite itself has the gap in there that we can display it, which sounds good, and it doesn't take up any extra memory in GameMaker, because when you when it makes its texture pages, it ignores any completely transparent stuff that it can cut away without losing anything. But if you're reading them from disk, I am pretty sure that the raw dimensions of the sprite will affect how long it takes to load that thing in. It's going to be a certain amount of like loading, and if we are using a huge amount, like 90% of the sprite is wasted, it's just blank. And if we're doing that, then we are basically taking 10 times longer to load each sprite than we should be. Because if it was trimmed down, it would be loading a much smaller sprite, because it can't really trim out the transparent stuff until it's read in that it is transparent, right? It doesn't know that it's transparent until it's read that data, so it has to read this amount of data for when all it really needs to read is that amount of data. So we're going to have to probably trim those down, and then now we can't do the neat trick of just, we'll just place it directly on top of the module. Or we can, but to do so we need to calculate where the origin will be, the centre of the sprite, the anchor point, like when you tell it to draw at 1, 1, which part of the sprite is at the 1, 1 pixel. Right now it's the centre of the sprite, but it will need to be a coordinate that is not even on the sprite. It's going to be like negative something. It's going to be off the edge of the sprite. And that's not too hard to calculate in an individual case, but we've got to calculate it in every one of these cases. There's something like 32 or maybe even 64 different fringes. It's ridiculous. And B, now the origin of each sprite is going to be different. And loading in sprites from disk, right now the way it works is it automatically picks the centre of the sprite to set the origin. And it won't be able to do that anymore. It'll have to load it in differently for each different fringe. And that's one of those things where, like, yeah, I could write an exception for every single fringe where it's hard-coded where the centre of it should be. But that feels like a pain in the ass, because if it changes, then we'd have to change all that code. And what I'd like to do is have it in the file name. That's the only thing I can think of. That you would make the asset, you would give it the right file name, and then at the end of the file name it would be like 128x64, and that means it's 128 in from the x coordinate and 64 down from the y coordinate. Then I've got to read that number in from the file name somehow, and I also want it to intelligently decide whether there is an origin coordinate specified in the file name, because if there isn't, I want it to default to being centered. I don't want it, for all the centered sprites, I don't want to specify where the center is. That would be terrible. That'd be very fiddly and different for everything. So I need it to intelligently detect. You know, as I'm saying this doesn't seem worth it, because putting them in the file name, who's going to have to do that? Is it going to be me or is it going to be John? Because John's making the art assets, but I'm handling the code side of like where it's displaying it, and so it's kind of like a toss-up as to who's better suited to figure out what pixel dimensions the origin should be from the edge of the sprite. I have a horrible feeling it might be me, in which case there's no reason not to do it in code, because it's still specifying it in one place. You still have to change it in one place if you change it. And it would save me a bunch of work writing a system to read things in from file names. I think I'm just not going to think about it until I've done all the rooms and all of the deco sprites, and then we'll come to fringes last and see if it really has to be done that awkward, stupid way.